take a look at Crude, the oil game. This is a redesign of something called McMulti. I'm not aware of it other than through this game and through Board Game Geek when I looked into it. This game, McMulti was designed in the 70s, so you can get an idea that we're maybe some streamlining or whatever going on, but this is a design without some of the elements that fit into kind of the modern Euro. It's fairly heavily luck dependent, although there's a lot of strategy. There's just room for a lot of uncertainty in the game. Anyway, I've got it set up at the point before the players do their setup, as it were. Now, this is kind of weird because this game has some actually really intriguing concepts to it that I've never seen before. On top of what seems like, you know, a standard supply and demand type of system where you're just buying and selling goods out of, in this case, oil and gasoline, out of a couple of commodities markets. Okay. So at the beginning of the game, you set it up like this. Each person is going to have a quadrant of the board, and they have the oil and gasoline reserves associated with that quadrant. And maybe, I don't know, I don't know how to cope. What else did they do? Well, that's about it. Everybody's going to get, I think, 200 of these. We'll hand that out. But they spend a lot of it right away. You set the market conditions to recovery. Hey, this reminds me of one of them New England Rails type games, right? Apparently they took that idea from this, I would say. There's a set of news items which we also have to set up. The first is the most likely news item, and the second is the slightly less likely. Chances are they're both going to happen. You just don't know how long it's going to take for them to come around in terms of the pulse of the game. You got a pile of money that I showed. You've got these commodities markets in oil now and gasoline. Now you have a foreign market in oil and a domestic market in oil, and both also have a gasoline market. And then you have a consumer market, which is sort of the price at the pump. You have some little pictograms here which are largely indecipherable. If you know English, you probably want to not try to think about them too hard. If you're having trouble with the rules and you can't read English and that's why you're having trouble, these aren't going to help much, but maybe they'll help as a reminder if somebody else is explaining the rules to you. But they're not very helpful otherwise. And then you have this little track which is going to represent something to do with the passage of time. You'll see how it works. It's kind of weird. Now I'm sure other people have gone over this game in terms of the rules, but I'm going to do my normal rule intro, and I think this is a long enough game that I'm not going to just be able to shove it in and say, oh yeah, we can do this all in one video. It means that the intro video will be pretty short. The review might be longer because of this, though, and I think there's a lot of interesting things to go into, so I'm not too worried about that. So anyway, this is our setup. Somebody goes first. They give you two options. Stupid option of, hey, who filled their car up last? And other option, I don't know where those kinds of things came from, but the other option is just to randomize it. And the starting player is going to do something. They're going to buy material assets. Now they have the, let me explain these economic conditions. So they have a state to them. They have a value to the cost, to the price of gasoline at the pump. They have a general economic forecast, which is just sort of a little hint. And then they have purchase prices for the different assets and liquidation costs value if you sell it. And then you have a die roll. This is just to indicate how much it costs to increase to convert an oil rig to an oil drill to a rig when you strike oil. And then this is going to, and it's the same for every economic condition. This here section is going to be an indicator of what the probabilities are of the next economic condition to come into play. And there's some that you can't transition to from others. You know, you have to work your way through different steps. In general, a stronger economy means prices are just going to be higher. Prices to start new assets, prices for reselling your assets. Strangely in the game, well, maybe not too strangely, but the way the game works is the players tend to make their big investments when the economy is on a downturn. And that feels a little weird, and we'll see exactly what I mean as we go. Anyway, at the beginning of the game, you're in a recovery, which is not a bad period. The prices are fairly low, and they're likely that the economy is going to go up. So you're probably going to gamble on the economy going up, so you want to buy stuff here when you're allowed to, when it's cheap. And each of the different things can be bought, except for the oil rigs themselves. You have to strike oil to get them. So the cheapest thing you can get is an oil drill, which you'll be placing on the board in the hopes of converting it into a rig at some point, probably. Gas stations, this is where you sell gasoline that you have sitting around into the consumer market, but somebody's got to drive up and ask for gas. And finally, refineries, this is where you're able to move your crude oil into gasoline by refining it. And in general, even in the markets, the gasoline's worth a lot more. So refining oil into gas is a profitable venture in almost every case. And if you can sell it right at the pump, you get a significant increase in the price usually. Of course, the markets do determine what's going on there, and you don't really have a lot of control over the consumer market. What you have, except insofar as the players are selling too much gas to it, but you, as the players, you pretty much dominate the control of the foreign and domestic markets. You're the big players in the oil here. Not the only. There's some other effects. Okay, so the first player buys whatever assets he wants to out of his 200 million bucks, or is it 250? 200 million. It's 302 players. The 2 and 3 player rules change the game significantly. This is a game meant to be played in 4, but there are rules that allow you to play it in less players. And the 2 player works fine. It's pretty interesting, actually. So anyway, you spend however much you want. You may want to keep some cash on hand because there are some bad things that can happen. So we'll look at these and see, like the state sales tax is due soon. If that gets triggered early in the game, that's going to cost everybody a pile of money, and they may have to sell off things. So then each player gets a turn in order. And the first thing that happens in the player's turn is the market phase. They're allowed to buy and sell oil and gas from one of the 2 foreign or domestic market. They can deal in both the oil and gas in that market, but they can only deal in either the foreign or domestic market. So let's say I'm this guy. Well, there's no guy there. This is why it's confusing me. Is this is the divide. So this is part of this player, and it just really freaks me out because the board. Yeah, it's my OCD. Okay, whatever. These look like they're one player, and I'm gonna get confused. I know it. If we turn like this, does that help? I don't know. Okay. No, that makes it worse. Okay. So when you sell something, hey, you take it from here, you put it here, and you collect the money for that unit. And if you buy something, well, you take it from here, you put it here, and you pay the amount of money for that unit. And you're allowed to buy and sell as many as you like. No limits on the market here. The price just goes up and down. Kind of reminds me of Power Grid in terms of the way the market works, and it's a perfectly fine implementation of a market. Unlike Star Trader that I did recently, I don't think there's a problem in this kind of market. The only thing is there's no slack in the market, which means the price that you sell for is the price somebody else buys for, which may seem okay, but it may not be accurate. Anyway, after you do that, then you roll these 2 dice. And probably not on the board because there's going to be all kind of crap on the board. But those dice are going to indicate the row and the column, well, or the 2 rows, depending on how you want to look at it, because it doesn't really feel like row and column here, that are going to be active for you. Now what's going to happen is every item that you have on the board can get hit by these rolls. So if I had a refinery here, it's hit by this roll. What that means is I can convert one of my oils into a gasoline. Hey, that's almost always profitable, good idea. I could be in a location like this where I get hit twice because there's 2 dice hitting a particular thing. Well, then I'd be able to do twice as much of that. So I'd convert 2. With a gas station, if it gets hit, for each hit that it takes, you're allowed to sell one of your gasoline to the consumer market. For each oil rig, we'll ignore the stuff you can have and go to this magic stuff that you don't know how you get or whatever. For each time the oil rig is hit, it produces 2 oil. If it's hit twice, it produces 4 oil. Okay, now here's the complicated one. This guy gets hit, nothing happens. But if he gets hit twice, if you roll the intersection to make him really unlikely, you're allowed to upgrade him to an oil rig. The cost for that is going to be $5 more than $5 times the number of oil rigs on the board, basically. It's worded differently in the rules, but it essentially comes down to that. I think they worded it very poorly in the rules, and it could lead to confusion. But I'm pretty sure this is how it's meant to be. If I'm not, well, the rules are really, really fucking confusing. Anyway, I shouldn't say that with plastic pieces. Okay, I don't know. So if I got this roll and nobody else has an oil rig on the board yet, I can pay $5 and I convert it to one of these. And now when it gets hit, it produces oil. Now, there are rules about what you can do and not do with stuff that you produce. So, for example, when you just produce oil, you're not allowed to refine it immediately. When you just build an oil rig, you're not allowed to produce oil from it, which seems pretty reasonable, to tell you the truth. But there's no prohibition, and I'm going to put this as you can do it, against refining, against selling oil that you refined this turn, selling the gas that you just refined this turn. And there's no prohibition against using money that you may have gained, say by selling gasoline, to spend on your oil rig. These are 2 little ambiguities that could be resolved either way. This is the way I'm going with it because there's specific prohibitions in the rules. And it looks like, I don't know, it looks like they should have clarified. But so now, after you do your production roll, which triggers all of this stuff, then we go to the neighbor phase. And first you go to, say, the red die, and that neighbor has his column affected the same way. Now, obviously, he's not going to be able to upgrade drills to rigs, but he can produce oil, he can refine it, etc. if he's hit. And then you go over here and do the same to your other neighbor. The guy across the board from you doesn't get affected, though. This allows you to set up your pieces in conjunction with someone else so that if they get lucky or if you get lucky, you bring them along with you. I'm not sure how much else is going on here, but it gives you that opportunity to put your eggs in the same basket or in a different basket. And you really have that choice from the beginning of the game. First player has to put his pieces down wherever he wants. Second player and fourth player get to choose based on him, and then third player gets to choose based on the second player, etc. Of course, the first player, although he has a disadvantage in terms of where he puts his pieces and might get responded to, it's a pretty minor disadvantage, and he does have the advantage of going first, I guess, and taking, I don't know. I'm not sure that there's much swing either way. Okay, after you handle both your neighbors doing that, you go to the assets phase, where you're once again allowed to buy up stuff, but you're also allowed to sell stuff. You're only allowed to sell stuff if the die rolls hit your row, column, whatever. And you sell it at the liquidation price. Now, the liquidation prices don't tend to be terribly good, but you can make money off this, especially with the drilling rigs, which, say this has a purchase price of 5. Well, if we go to prosperity, the liquidation is 12. So I can make a significant amount of money by churning that. If I look at the refinery, that's 64. It only goes to 120. So I'm not getting the same multiplier. But you still do want to do this at some point because, I haven't told you the victory conditions, but they involve cash on hand. They're a little complicated, but a little more complicated than that. But okay. So now, you can choose to sell and buy different items. One notable thing that the rules do not seem to exclude is you could have upgraded a drill to an oil rig, and then you can sell the oil rig. Now, remember, the drill only cost you, maybe $5 in the recovery era. The cost to turn it into an oil rig might cost you only $5 if it's the first one, or some fairly small amount of money, but these things can sell quite high. So for example, here in Prosperity, they sell for $75. So you can turn around and make a good deal of money off them. And I did that I played this with my wife, and I tried to do that, where I just bought all drills at one point and just tried to make cash off of my commodities. It didn't quite work, but I was behind when I started it, and I caught up a lot of ground. So I'm not sure I think it's a fairly viable strategy. Okay, then you come to the end of turn. Hey, what happens there while you pass the dice? Hey, I forgot a couple of things. When you roll these dice during the production roll phase, the difference between the two dice moves this die forward. So for example, here the difference is 1, it'll only move 1. If it's doubles, some special stuff happens and the die doesn't move. If the die reaches or exceeds here, you've reached a new era. At that point in your turn, when you roll the dice, you roll a green die, compare it to here, and get a new type of economic climate. Then, when you sell these gases, they start stacking up as they lower the price. Be careful. All the stuff in the game is serpentine. It works once you're used to it, and it works better, but it's really confusing at times. Anyway, so if this price has dropped down to 23, great. Or actually, it's 23 or 24 if it's the commodities, but you can never buy from the consumer market. We want your gas back. Okay, so then the next thing that happens is you clear these suckers out. You look at this number, and that's going to be the number of red boxes that you transit upward. If it's a negative number, it's downward. So I'd go 1, 2, 3, and this would be the new base price of gasoline. This gives gasoline a very strange cyclic action, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, but maybe it's representing something in terms of the delivery of the gas or whatever. I'm not sure. But what it does is, as people sell more and more gas, the price goes down, but there's a constant drive pushing it back up. And because the price only goes down by 1 each time, it really isn't that huge an effect. It's not really showing the supply and demand on the market, but that's okay, because the players don't really seem to control the supply very well, except insofar as they're actually selling it. And demand is nearly unlimited. Okay. So what was the other thing? If you roll doubles, if you roll double 1 or 3, this event takes place. If you roll double 6, this event takes place. a new event is flipped over and takes the secondary event position. If the primary was used, it moves up and takes the primary position, and the new one takes the secondary. Some of these events are canceled out by the other numbers on doubles, i.e. 2, 4, 5, whatever. So you do have to, anytime you roll doubles, you have to think about it a little bit and make sure that things are as they seem. Okay, so now we were jumping back to the production roll. Now we go back around to the end of turn. Yeah, you pass the dice, right? Okay, but there's one more thing. Just before you pass the dice, if you have 750 million, these are millions. It's kind of neat, $25 million on a coin. If you have 75, it's kind of neat, $100 million bills. If you have $750 million in cash, you can declare that the game will be over. Everybody else gets one turn. And during that turn, they can do all their normal stuff. And then, after the person, presumably to your right in the normal game, but I'll of course go counterclockwise, assuming the last player in the sequence, finishes their turn, as soon as they do, assuming they do, they will, then all your assets that are remaining on the board for all the players get sold back at the worst price possible, which is depression prices. So when somebody declares the game is over, your goal during the assets phase is to liquidate everything. And in fact, during the market phase, it may well be to dump almost all of your gas and oil into the markets. But that's something separate. Of course, if it's depression when they do it, or if it's depression when it gets around to you, you're not going to get much of an advantage out of that. You don't end up getting any cash for your oil and gas reserves that you have stockpiled. And the person with the most money wins. And there is, I think, a tiebreaker. Okay, if you end up with... you count up the total number of oil and gas barrels as a tiebreaker if needed. It's not really very helpful. Okay, two other things. 2-player and 3-player games. So I played the 2-player game, and you start with more cash, and you start with 2 diagonally across from each other. Board positions. And basically you'll be playing each of those board positions as its own player turn, but you share your money. But you don't share the resources. So if one guy has oil and gas, you can't sell it for him, and stuff like that. Which is kind of weird, but okay. And that makes for an interesting way to design it. In 3 players, you start with 250 million. One player is a ghost player, and they get a production roll. Basically, so their neighbors don't get screwed. And they also generate events, etc. They give some strategy notes in here. One of the things that they really point out is, hey, this is one of those games where you don't want to be doing what other people are doing necessarily. If you're the first person doing something, that's great, but if 2 people are doing the same thing, they will probably conflict with each other, and that makes sense. If you're hoarding the oil, while other people might be selling it because you've got the prices raised up too high. And likewise, if you're focusing on the consumer gas market, well, you might, if too many people are doing that, the prices go low, so there might be opportunities elsewhere for other things. And there are a lot of other things you can do. Like I said, you can liquidate, you can play these things as if they're a commodity themselves. Of course, you got the problem, you got to roll the dice, and you got to hit the right things to sell them. But you can make such a big margin that the excess investment that you pick up is fine. And I mean, it's not like it's useless stuff. It'll make money at the end of the game anyway, or get back some of your money. But it'll also possibly turn into oil wells and produce and whatever. And if it turns into an oil well, hey, you can sell it for lots of money then, right away. All right, let's send this up and I'll start playing.